Adding to Hume's contributions, 18th-century English economist Henry Thornton described the Phillips curve in his essay on the paper credit of Great Britain. He posits that monetary expansion, or an increase in the money supply, will stimulate employment by raising prices, and the reverse, decrease in the money supply, or deflation, will cause unemployment by lowering prices. Only when money and prices are continually changing will there be economic growth. Thornton also writes about the source of this trade-off between money, prices, and employment. Because there is inflation, real wages shrink while real profits grow, so wages constantly lag behind profits, and this is why there is economic activity amidst the trade-off. Like Hume, Thornton does not incorporate inflation expectations into his analysis of the Phillips curve. Unlike Hume, Thornton does not believe in using the Phillips curve for policy purposes because he believed inflation to be a veritable evil, because allowing policymakers to stimulate the economy with inflation would cause injustice and social discontent, and there would be little economic output to show for it. The 19th century saw a debate over the Phillips curve between British economists Thomas Attwood and John Stuart Mill. Attwood believed inflation was justified and necessary because it would lead to full employment, and advocated for the government to achieve zero unemployment no matter how much money was needed to flood the market. John Stuart Mill opposed this, believing there to be a difference between perceived prices and actual prices, causing the trade-off between unemployment and the price level. Also, this trade-off is temporary because it will vanish once perceptions match reality. He calls it a money illusion, and contends that not everyone can be fooled into believing that inflation can permanently stimulate the economy. Mill's analysis provides the foundation for the expectations-augmented Phillips curve that we have today. In the 20th century, U.S. economist Irving Fisher took the theoretical basis for the Phillips curve and made it a graph. Using U.S. economic data for the period 1915 to 1925, Fisher's chart displayed a causal relationship between price changes and employment. He theorized that there are factors which don't allow costs to adjust as fast as prices when prices change. These factors include fixed contracts between the employer and employee, and the fact that customs are very inflexible. Changes in prices automatically affect profits, which then affect the level of employment. Therefore, inflation influences unemployment. Fisher was also the first to write an equation measuring the change in price against the change in time to support the market clearing version of the Phillips curve. Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen provided an explanation and equation for the Phillips curve contrasting Fisher's argument. He said that as unemployment causes the wage inflation rate, low unemployment will cause wages to rise, whereas high unemployment will keep wages low, according to the law of supply and demand. Tinbergen is the first to describe this trade-off between unemployment and inflation in terms of supply and demand, which meant he interpreted the Phillips curve as representing a lack of equilibrium in the labor market. Along with this interpretation, he included an econometric equation derived from the Netherlands economic data for the period 1923 to 1933. He later suggested variables to the equation for cost of living changes and the relative power of unions. Tinbergen's work was continued nearly 20 years later when two American economists developed similar econometric equations. Klein and Goldberger also based their equations on the supply and demand view that wages change in response to excess labor demand in an effort to bring the market back to equilibrium. These equations focus primarily on U.S. economic data from the period 1929 to 1952. Just 3 years after Klein and Goldberger published their econometric study, we finally meet the economist who named the Phillips curve. A.W. Phillips, a professor at the London School of Economics, drew up the most modern form of the curve using British economic data for the period 1861 to 1913. This consisted of a downward-sloping curve on a scatter diagram. Phillips then tested more recent data for the years 1948 to 1957, which aligned closely to his original curve, and concluded that the curve would have long-run stability. Given this long history of the Phillips curve, with influences from at least 10 economists over 2 centuries, one may ask why this is named after a relatively recent economist, who seemingly inherited all of his information needed to construct the curve. Yes, Phillips inherited most of the concepts surrounding the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and others had drawn this relationship on graphs as well. However, Phillips was the first to determine the long-run durability of his curve, and he had incorporated over 100 years of economic data and found the relationship relatively constant. This made the curve a hit among Keynesian economists, who used it to determine the best combination between unemployment and inflation, and then used it to justify government intervention in the labor market, or use of discretionary monetary policy to achieve this best combination. Thus, Phillips' name stuck and has been referred to as the Phillips curve ever since. In the 1970s, the trade-off touted by the curve no longer held up. Supply-side economists argue that this occurred because expansionary fiscal policy caused aggregate demand to shift right, and although unemployment fell in the short term, the rise in price levels caused costs to rise, and short-run aggregate supply shifted left. So the economy ended up where it was before the expansionary fiscal policy, only the price level was higher, so inflation had occurred. This process was repeated several times, with inflation rising higher and higher, while economic growth stagnated, and there was no accompanying fall in unemployment, as the Phillips curve would have predicted. Supply-side policies enacted in the 1980s and onwards showed the unemployment rate falling without inflation rising, which has forced a new take on the trade-off. The long-run Phillips curve shows that there is a certain unemployment rate at which inflation will stabilize, or prices will rise at the same rate every year. Thank you for listening to this exciting history of a very underappreciated macroeconomic concept, and we hope you'll spread this valuable knowledge of the Phillips curve.